In 2013, I started looking into the humanitarian and political crisis at Europe's doorstep, often called the migrant crisis. And I began traveling along Europe's borders for the Vice news series Europe or Die. I thought it would be a simple story to tell. People desperate to enter versus the forces tasked with keeping them out. Little did I know, I had stumbled on one of the most complicated ethical issues of our time. How to justify the physical and bureaucratic walls that separate our human family.
Pourquoi ces frontières? Maintenant, il y a les frontières même dans l'eau, on te dit ici, il y a la frontière dans l'eau, tu vois la mer. On te dit il y a une frontière, tu vois les airs. On te dit qu'il y a les frontières même dans les airs. Mais qu'on ne devrait pas défendre à un humain de passer d'un chemin à l'autre.
So that was Melilla. He had to escape Cameroon, and his identity changed overnight from that of a star student with a bright future in politics into that of a migrant. In this clip that you just saw, he had just made it into Europe after a dangerous 2-year journey, crossing deserts and borders, and seeing fellow travelers and friends die before his eyes. To reach Melilla, which is one of Spain's 2 enclaves on Morocco's northern coast, and the last remnants of its colonial empire, he first had to get across a 3-layer razor-wire-clad fence. It took him 8 attempts to surmount it. Many of his friends had wounds from the razor wire and broken limbs, thanks to heavy-handed Spanish and Moroccan border forces, who target their hands and feet so that they can't climb. Nearly thousands in his situation are often described with words like swarms, floods, invading. Yet Nelly entered a piece of land that is only Spanish through colonization, and he's from Cameroon, that was invaded by several European empires. In fact, when decolonization began, only 70 years ago, the Middle East and Africa were left carved up using unnatural boundaries that separated ethnic groups and forced others together, which is arguably at the root of many of today's conflicts, which are pushing people to move, ironically, towards Europe. As one of Europe's only 2 land borders with the African continent, thousands of people try to enter Melilla every year. And it's not exactly a welcoming place. Actually, Melilla is the most nationalist place I've ever been to. There was an unusually high concentration of Spanish flags, and it's the only part of Spain that still has a statue of the dictator Franco. But perhaps it's precisely because Melilla is a tiny piece of Spain, separated from Europe by a sea, while only a barrier divides it from the African continent, that the urge to enforce and protect its Spanish identity is so strong. This is a good example of how one of our tools to define our identity, where we end and the other begins, is a boundary. In this case, a physical fence, that to the Spanish border guards seems to justify violently beating people back or escorting them back to Morocco without offering them legal assistance or processing them first. This goes against not only EU, but international law. And since Spanish border forces have been able to carry on with these brutal tactics, it seems the rest of Europe condones it. Melilla is a microcosm of the European Union's contradictory migration policies, that on the one hand have beautiful human rights laws that offer asylum, and on the other hand, having systems and practices doing the opposite. Reaching Europe has become the world's deadliest border crossing. Why? In the mid-90s, the EU began abolishing its internal borders, all while fortifying its external ones. This has made it near impossible for migrants and refugees to reach Europe legally. And since you have to be on EU soil to claim asylum, it's made people smuggling, selling deadly journeys, big business. More than 30,000 people have died since the year 2000. not at the hands of dictators or violent militias, but on their way to safety at Europe's doorstep. Europe's closed-door policy has cost far too many human lives. And it costs taxpayers billions. And it's inefficient. I've seen firsthand that Europe's attempts to close its borders don't work. Nelly and his friends willingly risked their lives jumping the Spanish fence into Melilla, shouting, "Europe or die," as it was the only way that they could see a future. The Syrian family I met in Turkey, living in a moldy basement, were saving up money to go on the death boat to Greece. Yes, the father used the words death boat. He explained that they would rather die trying for a better life than lead one in which they already feel dead. When you're desperate to rebuild a life and a future for yourself and your family, there's no border force big enough or raise a wire fence high enough to stop you. I've spent a long time trying to understand how Europe gets away with systems that have deadly consequences and practices that go against both its moral and legal standards. One reason could be how difficult it is to receive thousands of migrants today, especially when many other EU countries refuse to share the burden equally. A second reason could be the fear of criminals and terrorists getting in. But when you close borders, that forces people to break in, meaning you lose track of who comes in and out. And isn't that information the whole point of border control? A third reason could be the EU's complicated bureaucracy and lack of political will. But I think that an even bigger reason for the brutality at Europe's borders, as you could see in Melilla, is the rise in nationalism, fueled by fear of the other as a threat to the idea of our way of life and resources. This makes it easy for politicians to win votes by blaming immigration for structural injustices in our societies, like benefit cuts and unemployment, when in reality, they're largely caused by an unequal global financial system. Anthropologist Ruben Anderson says that today, there's this idea that borders are vulnerable and that people are a threat. I don't know. Who looks more vulnerable to you? Our geopolitical status quo protects national borders as a matter of survival, while the boundaries of human dignity for those actually trying to survive are crossed time and again. Throughout time, as you can see in this video, borders have regularly changed, often in the aftermath of bloody conflict. With growing nationalism across Europe and beyond, awareness of the relatively short history of our existing borders is important, and that nation states with passports and borders, yes, these concepts that we take for granted, have only existed, in most cases, for about 200 years. Before that, we had city-states and ever-fluctuating kingdoms and empires that ruled over people of varying cultural and ethnical identities. Considering the complexity of borders, should a most valuable aspect of belonging to a place be that you were born there, or that you actively chose it and contribute to that society? Like Einstein, Marie Curie, Picasso, Camus, Zlatan, and countless other migrants have done. After initial costs, migration has been proven to not only boost the economy, but it is and has always driven human progress, because creativity, entrepreneurship, and love know no boundaries. We're all migrants. We all migrated from Africa across the continent as the Ice Age receded, if we look into our past, that is. And we're actually all genetically related, which might be why the expression human family exists. As a mixed background Swede living in London, I'm a migrant. Well, a privileged migrant. I imagine some of you also enjoy the privilege to travel pretty much wherever you want, while our countries are fortifying their borders to prevent others to have the same freedom of movement. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all humans are born with equal and inalienable rights and fundamental freedoms. It was signed after World War II to prevent a similar catastrophe. Sadly, rather than these human values, it seems like we're increasingly abiding by the mantra of George Orwell's Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Nelly is now trying to rebuild a life in Madrid. And when I saw him earlier this year, he was telling me about the invisible borders that he's now facing inside Spanish society. It's not just physical borders that separate us. Borders exist around ideologies, beliefs, class, gender, ethnic origin, and various other norms. These subliminal borders within our societies affect how we think, behave, and who and what we come into contact with. I've spent a long time thinking about whether we need borders to define our identity. And I realized that without some boundaries, at least in a metaphysical sense, we'd probably feel overwhelmed. Boundaries help us feel like we know who we are, or at least what society wants us to be. And this is important to be aware of, because many of our values are not necessarily ones that we've actively chosen ourselves, but have been handed down to us by the norms of our environment. And if we take them for granted, without questioning why they exist, and if we truly approve of them, we risk, albeit unintentionally, enforcing oppressive structures, like the deadly paradox that is Europe's migration policies. But in Europe's defense, the reason that it's become a destination for migrants and refugees, aside from its geographic accessibility, is that more than most places, it upholds at least the promise of high human rights standards. And as the EU, the UN, and countless NGOs have pointed out, this is not a European, but a global responsibility. A global shared responsibility is not only necessary to tackle ever-increasing migration, but also to address the reasons why people have to leave their homes in the first place. Climate change, conflict, pandemics, global inequality, none of which respect borders. But how do we even begin to tackle these big issues that will define our future if we allow the national interest to be more important than the well-being of our human family and the planet? We probably need to rethink today's rigid national borders. But for that to be possible, we'd first have to get rid of, or at least minimize, global inequality, ingrained us and them thinking, and streamline value systems, which, when tackling fundamentalism and skewed views on race and gender, would probably take generations. So there's a long way to go. But there are ideas out there for what a different system could look like. Political theorist Benjamin Barber, in his book If Mayors Rule the World, suggests that since cities and regional administrations serve people better and are more efficient than national governments, that we could have a sort of United Nations of mayors. More than half of the world's population now lives in towns and cities. By 2050, it'll be 70%. What if towns and cities could form a network with rural regions that know how to protect their natural resources and heritage, and unite behind values and policies that protect both humans and the environment? These are exciting times because today, we actually have the tools to communicate and organize in global cooperatives. Yes, a more equal world for everyone would come with a cost. But aren't today's borders that we think stand for safety and stability also fueling global inequality and social segregation, which is precisely what makes the world less safe and costs a hell of a lot more, not only in money? Is it time to break the barriers that are preventing sustainable progress? I travel a lot for work, and I live in a country in which I didn't grow up, so I often feel uprooted and yearn for a sense of belonging. The notion of having roots is an emotionally powerful one. And this is what nationalism preys on. But more and more people now are born of mixed national and religious backgrounds, and the world is already irrevocably interconnected. I believe and hope that we'll eventually get over this idea of feeling kinship primarily with people who have the same club membership card, passport, as us. In reality, we don't have roots, we have feet. Just look at your legs. And everywhere we go, we leave traces. Just like the places we visit leave their mark on us, in our memories and how we experience the world. The world shapes us, just like we shape the world. When you look at our planet, everything is in constant flux. There are no borders, aside from natural ones like seas and mountains. Borders are a man-made concept, one that seems to enable us to dehumanize fellow humans. But on the upside, since borders are man-made, they can be remade and reinvented to be as mobile and expansive as we are, and everything else on this planet is. Remade to better suit our collective future, and to make sure that we leave a livable planet for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you.